Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. Annie Laurie and I are co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this weekly show. Today we're going to meet a major news correspondent who's written a book about how the evangelical movement has failed a generation.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at ffrf.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
How has the evangelical movement failed a generation? Our guest today, Jon Ward, will tell us how, and also talk about growing up in a family cult that taught that the apocalypse was coming.
Jon Ward is the chief national correspondent at Yahoo News. He's covered American politics, he's covered culture for 2 decades, including as a White House correspondent, traveling aboard Air Force One, and as a national affairs correspondent, writing about 2 presidential campaigns. He hosts a podcast called The Long Game. He's written for The Washington Post, The New Republic, Politico, Vanity Fair, HuffPost, and The Washington Times. He's the author of the book, Camelot's End, Kennedy versus Carter and the Fight That Broke the Democratic Party.
Jon Ward's new book, just out last spring, is called Testimony, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation. The book not only recounts his childhood, but evangelical politics right through January 6th, COVID, and the abortion bans. Thank you so much for joining us, Jon.
Thank you for having me, Dan and Annie. I appreciate it.
I really enjoyed your book. You tell quite a story about how you were raised and how you got where you are today. Let's start with your childhood. You know, like you, I also grew up in an evangelical/Pentecostal home, but you said that you grew up in an actual family cult and that your father's path mirrors that of millions of white evangelicals in America. Tell us more about that cult and your father's beliefs.
The term family cult is new to me. I think the term cult is one that I would have never used growing up. I think in retrospect, there were definitely elements of a cult in the church I was raised in. And, you know, I think I'll leave it to the experts to determine whether it was a full-on cult or not. But there was a lot of hallmarks of that. My family, though, was rather healthy in a lot of ways. I still, respect a lot of the things that my dad and mom did in the ways that they parented us. I think the overall, hallmark of the way my family interacted with the church, the most negative thing was that our families, I think, sovereignty might be the wrong word, but it's one that I've thought of over the years, was really sublimated below the decision-making authority of the church and the church leaders. And so this was something you saw a lot in the church, which did have cultish elements in it, which is, fathers and mothers really sort of handing over authority and influence over their own decisions to the leaders of the church. And that was where I think a lot of things went wrong, not only for my family, but for many others.
You said sovereignty. You were involved with the sovereign grace movement, isn't that right?
That's correct, although that was a later iteration of the church. When we started out in the 70s, I was born in 77. The church started about 6 to 12 months before that. But my parents and others had been part of the Jesus movement, in the early 70s. And in those first 10, 15, 20 years, it was kind of like your church, more Pentecostal. And then into the 90s, actually, it became that sovereign grace iteration, which was very Calvinist, very focused on, strict theology. And they began to lose some of the Pentecostal charismatic elements, but retained others as well. So it was actually a bit of a weird hodgepodge, both in terms of ecclesiology and I've actually had people. Russell Moore, who's the head of Christianity Today magazine now, has told me that from an experiential point of view, the mixture of the emotionalism of the charismatic element mixed with the very inward-focused, self-abasing nature of Calvinist theology was really the worst of both worlds.
So you said things went wrong when you were describing growing up in that church. Can you be more explicit?
Where do you want me to start? I mean, there were many things that went wrong, but the point I was making is that when a father and a mother, basically franchise, the decisions over how they're going to raise their children to other people, that's just never a good, sign. It's just a sign that you've kind of suspended, not belief or disbelief, but you've suspended the ability and the willingness to think critically and to make decisions based on not just reason, but your own gut and intuition, as well as just knowledge that's available to anyone who wants to pursue it. And that question about a cult really got me thinking about the ways that people just sort of gave up that autonomy and that agency.
Well, you did think your way beyond that, obviously. How did that happen? How did those questions about questioning all of that, how did that start?
Well, part of it, I think, was a bit organic for me. I was, we're all complicated people with different elements to our personalities. I was an oldest of 7. And so I had a willingness to please and a willingness to perform and a willingness to go along. But I was also contrarian and like to ask questions, like to understand the reason why, the answer to the question why. And I think that was the beginning of it for me. It's hard to stay in a cultish environment or a dogmatic environment if you are that way. And then probably during college, when I had professors, I think the church or the fundamentalist mindset is, kids go off to college and they're poisoned with all these bad ideas. And that, you got to keep them away from that. Otherwise they will leave the church or leave the faith. For me, it was nothing quite like that. It was more just I went to college and I began to have an awakening of a passion for learning. I had a Shakespeare professor who really just did nothing but encourage me. I would write papers. He would encourage and kind of fan that flame of enthusiasm for writing and for learning and for expression and exploration. And I think that was actually a really important element of beginning to move out of that very small, cloistered environment in that world.
So the church you grew up in was very chauvinistic, wasn't it? How were women treated? And wasn't there cover-up of sexual abuse?
There's a book actually out right now called The Woman They Wanted from Shannon Harris, who is the ex-wife of Josh Harris, who wrote a very famous book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Josh was actually the pastor at the church that I grew up in. He came along around the time I was in college. And Shannon's book does a really good job of giving you a very up-close, first-person look at two things. One, the experience, I think, for people, both men and women, of having your identity and your agency and your ability to think and your dreams sort of squashed, and the process of being turned into something of a zombie or a robot. But she also, underneath that or as part of that or above that, describes and details the experience of being a woman in that environment. And I think she's careful to note that she was treated with respect in sort of personal interactions, but in the hierarchy of values, in the value system of our church, women were second-class citizens, 100%. And so they were, she was described as being treated as something of a spectator at her own wedding and in her own marriage, something of an appendage, someone who is useful only to the extent that she supports her husband and births children and then raises them. And so that's, not unique to our church environment. I think there were elements of it that were actually less chauvinistic than others, where like this toxic masculinity is celebrated. But it was male dominated, male centered, and many women's lives were unfortunately, came to less than they could have been because of this way of treating them.
And there was sexual abuse uncovered in the church?
The sexual abuse issue is one where I think there's many different, lines of critique you could take. There have been, there's one person I know of who's in prison right now. And I'll just talk about his case just so that I'm on firm footing as to what I'm talking about. That case and others of alleged abuse, the hallmark here was that the leaders thought that they knew better than outside authorities, whether that would be police or, namely, first and foremost, police and law enforcement, but anything beyond that as well. And so their instinct always was to try to handle things internally first, and then they also were very focused, I think, on going back to your point about chauvinism and patriarchy. I think one of the greatest evils they could conceive of was a household with no father. And so even if a person, and there are stories of this happening, even if a man abused his children, their focus was on getting that family, quote unquote, restored and having, reconciliation where the abused forgives the abuser and the abuser is restored to his role as father and husband. Obviously, there's a lot of problems with that when there is a need for justice and for consequences and for restoration and for healing for the victims. And so, there's a lot of different elements, as I said, you could go to, but that to me is the hallmark where things really went wrong, is they tried to handle these things internally. Was it a cover-up? I think they thought they were just handling it internally. I think that's a legal term that could probably be used, but that's sort of quibbling over details, I think.
You're in a good position, I think, with your background to write about how the evangelical movement has failed a generation. In your book, Testimony, you write that a commitment to truth involves a passionate embrace of critical thinking. Why do you say that in the evangelical movement there is just black and white thinking and dishonesty and oversimplification rather than critical thinking?
That's, I think, a question that goes to the heart of human nature, because I don't think that fundamentalist thinking is only found in Christian circles or even only found in religious circles. I think you can find fundamentalist thinking in many different groups and tribes. And I think the reason for the desire for black and white answers is because it's a complicated world, and it's a frightening place at times. And black and white answers give us a sense of comfort that we know what's going on and that we can have some sense of control over it. I think for leaders, discouraging critical thinking, at least beyond a point, definitely makes their job easier. It makes it easier to control people and to keep things, under wraps, heading forward, rather than sort of dealing with the chaos and complexity that can come when you encourage questions and encourage open-ended thinking. But I think that's a problem with religion going back thousands of years, as you guys are. That's part of your mission, I think.
Well, that was my background too. I remember that. It was hard. Critical thinking is hard work, and to switch from a binary brain to a complicated brain, that's quite a move. So we have to take a break, Jon, and we're talking with Jon Ward, author of the new book, Testimony, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation. And in the next segment, let's talk about politics, and more specifically, how the evangelical movement failed a generation. We'll be right back after this.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
I'm Charlotte, and I'm an out-of-the-closet atheist. I've always been intrigued by religion, and when I was younger, I desperately wanted to be religious, to be more accepted by my family, who was in majority Catholic. My parents didn't raise me religious. I was never baptized. I never took communion. Well, once I took communion, it was a pretty bad idea. I don't think it was worth a church full of angry elderly who glared at me as I waved the communion wafer back and forth asking my grandma what should be done with it. Also, the wine was pretty gross. From this experience and countless others, I came to 3 conclusions that sort of dictate how I live my secular life. One is that I find people of faith to be more exclusionary and less accepting. 2 is that I would rather work to please the people around me who I care about than someone who, to my knowledge, doesn't exist. And 3, that I would rather help people than pray for them.
And welcome back to Freethought Matters. We're continuing our conversation with Jon Ward, a former White House correspondent, national correspondent for Yahoo News now, who's written a book called Testimony, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation.
So, Jon, back in 2007, you were covering President Bush in the White House. You were traveling the world with Bush and then Obama, flying on Air Force One more than a dozen times. How did you go from that to working with Tucker Carlson and helping him launch the Daily Caller website? And what was that like?
Sure. In 2009, I had been at the Washington Times for 8 years. I just needed to do something else. I needed to make more money. I think we'd had our second child by that time. Tucker started his website sometime in 2009. I think I got hired there end of 2009. We launched the website the Daily Caller, early 2010. Tucker was a good boss. He was kind to people. Never saw him really mistreat anyone. He was fun to work for. At the time, I would not have imagined he would turn into this former Fox News demagogue that he has. But it was clear after about 6 months there, maybe even sooner, that the journalism that I had signed up for was not going to be as flashy or sexy as clickbait. It was going to be real journalism, which, you know, if you're going to build a real media outlet, that's going to take time, because it takes just doing the work day in, day out and building something steady and reliable. But it was clear to me that they were kind of more interested in taking shortcuts and going for traffic. And so that's when I began to look for an exit. Over the last 2 years or so, I have written about some of the inaccuracies in his program, and he's attacked me on his program, verbally attacked me on air. So it's been a strange road.
Well, we know the feeling. He's attacked us too. We've been on his show when he was on Fox News.
Well, you bullied them into it.
So in your book, you talk about what goes on inside the evangelical movement, and there's an awful lot of white Christian nationalism. What role does racism play within white conservative Christianity?
The best work I've seen on this, probably from a sociological standpoint, has come from Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. They've written at least one book together on the topic, where they've actually studied the role of race in Christian nationalism, and tackled it with like very detailed questionnaires.
And they've been on this show
We've
too.
had them on this show.
Yeah. I just spoke to Andrew this week about his new book, American Idolatry, which is also quite good. And I write in the book about how in the 70s, when my parents were coming into the evangelical faith, and I was born, there's scholarly work that has shown that, you know, the Republican Party or evangelical voters moved right in response to President Carter's administration cracking down on tax exemptions for schools that were private schools that were discriminating based on race. And he was going to take away their tax exemption for that. And that galvanized a lot of conservative religious voters. My experience, we didn't talk about race growing up. You know, I never heard from my parents a person of another race disparaged for the color of their skin. It was more of a colorblind, you know, and I understand, and I realize that that's, you know, now I think a lot of us feel like being colorblind is not good either, because, you know, it's a way of sort of, you know, whistling past the graveyard in terms of racial injustice. But as I write in the book, our errors were sins of omission. There was not a lot of overt racism in my youth, but I think, you know, I think Andrew Whitehead's work has shown that race is a huge factor in Christian nationalism, both racial anxiety and the desire for maintaining sort of a Christian nation, which has been thought of by a lot of people as a majority white Christian nation.
So why is abortion such a crucial issue for the evangelical support of the Republican Party?
It's a very black and white issue for a lot of people. You know, my father was involved in leading protests outside abortion clinics when I was a child. I write about how he was doing that and about how there were a spate of bombings of abortion clinics or medical facilities in the 80s, which I think was part of the reason why he moved away from that. But that was the only real political issue that we cared about, because we spent most of our time thinking about and going to church and thinking about the Bible and talking about God, and politics was something sort of dirty and not worth our time. That was, you know, my unique experience. Not every church is like that. But as a result, you know, our politics was very immature, very one-dimensional. And so all of our voting was shaped around that one issue. You know, I think that is representative of a lot of religious conservative voters in America.
Well, maybe that's because abortion is one of those issues where you can be simplistic black and white. A lot of people can be, so it's easy to just vote on that litmus test, yeah. You write in your book that you were shocked by the capitulation of so many evangelical Christians to Trump. Was that a turning point, or was that an issue for you?
Yeah, there's no question, not just for me, but for a lot of other people, that the last decade has been revelatory. You know, a lot of times people talk about the apocalypse as the end of the world, when in fact the word itself means, you know, revelation, as the last book of the Bible is called. And the last decade has been an apocalypse in that way, and that it has revealed a lot about the priorities of religious conservatives in this country. You know, I was quite shocked that not so much in the primary. I was shocked that he won the primary, but it wasn't until the general election against Hillary Clinton that I was really quite shocked by how many evangelicals supported Trump. And it was a lesson in how, when it came to politics, political identity became much more influential than religious identity and religious priorities. Some might say, you know, the religious priorities work together with those political priorities. But the religion I knew, the religion I was taught, was not in consensus or in line with, you know, what Donald Trump represented. And so you've seen a lot of reckoning with that over the past decade, and my book is just one of those stories.
In about 2 sentences, what were your feelings on January 6th, 2021?
I was in my bedroom and fell apart. I was shaking and crying and very distraught. You know, I think that tells you a lot.
Well, thank you, Jon Ward, for writing such an insightful book, Testimony: Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation. Thank you for being with us today, Jon.
It's a pleasure to speak with you both. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.